Autumn 1973, Charleston, South Carolina. The air was thick with the scent of wet oak leaves and distant salt from the nearby harbor, a mix that seemed to carry both memory and melancholy through the narrow streets of the old historic district. At the edge of White Point Garden, where cannons from forgotten wars stood silently among palmettos and moss-draped oaks, a man sat alone on a bench every afternoon, always at the same hour, always facing the same path. His name was Walter Grayson, though few who passed by ever knew it. He was an old man now, hunched slightly, with a weathered face and hands that moved with surprising grace across the worn keys of a battered accordion. He never asked for money. There was no open case in front of him. No signs, no eye contact, just the song, a slow, aching melody, quiet but persistent, rising each day as the sun dipped low behind the Charleston Battery. Some locals had grown used to him, the accordion man by the sea, as he was sometimes called. Tourists thought it quaint, maybe even poetic, a relic of the Old South playing mournful music in a park filled with Civil War statues. Few ever stopped to listen closely, fewer still recognized the tune. But to Walter, that song was everything. It wasn't from any published score. He had written it himself in the last days of 1944, crouched among ruins in Belgium during one of the coldest winters the war had ever seen. It was there, beneath crumbling brick and mortar, that he had fallen in love with Eleanor, an army nurse from Chicago, with a laugh that cut through mortar fire like sunlight through fog. They had found each other in the space between chaos, he a wounded infantryman, she his reluctant caretaker, and the melody had come to life between them like a promise made in whispers, one note at a time. He played it every afternoon because he didn't know what else to do. Because time had passed, and letters had gone unanswered, and the world had moved on without him. Because the war had ended, but his story had not. Walter Grayson didn't play for attention. He played because, somewhere deep down, he believed the song might still carry a signal, like a beacon across time, towards someone who might still be listening. Then, on an afternoon like any other, a woman in a blue wool coat stopped mid-step. Her purse slipped from her shoulder and landed softly on the grass. Her eyes locked on Walter's hands. Her lips parted, and in a voice barely louder than the breeze, she whispered a name no one else could have known. Thomas. Walter's fingers froze on the keys. It wasn't his real name, not anymore, but it was the one he had used in Europe, the name under which he had loved her, written to her, waited for her. And now, nearly 30 years later, she had spoken it aloud. Her name was Eleanor. If this story touches your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to tell real stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, prepare yourself, because what happens next will change everything. There are places in America where time seems to move slower. Not because the world outside pauses, but because certain hearts have chosen to beat to an older rhythm. White Point Garden in Charleston was one of those places. Each day, just as the humid southern air began to cool and the light stretched long and golden over the harbor, Walter Grayson would settle himself onto the same wooden bench beneath the same ancient oak tree, his old accordion resting in his lap like an heirloom that had outlived everyone who once touched it. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, and yet there was something unshakably gentle about him. His clothes, always clean but worn thin, looked like they hadn't changed much since the 1950s. His shoes had been resoled more than once. His cap, a soft olive-green military issue with faded stitching, carried the ghost of a rank and a war no one asked him about anymore. He began to play right as the sun dipped below the line of colonial rooftops across the water. Not a second earlier, not a minute later. Locals came to expect it, the same haunting song, the same broken rhythm as the wind off the sea. They called him the Old Accordion Man, or sometimes with a touch of reverence, Captain Walt, though no one knew if he'd ever truly held that title. The melody he played was unlike anything anyone could name, not classical, not folk. It hovered somewhere in between, a series of aching notes that seemed to hover in the air, just a second longer than they should, like a breath held too long. It was sad, but not sorrowful, tender, but not sentimental. The kind of tune that made people stop walking for a moment, glance over their shoulder, and wonder why their chest felt tight. To Walter, though, the music wasn't performance. It was memory. It was ritual. He had written the melody in December 1944, during the height of the Battle of the Bulge. Trapped with a small unit in a collapsed farmhouse on the outskirts of Bastogne, he had been wounded, shrapnel to the leg and chest, a medic's miracle away from dying. It was there, in that frozen ruin surrounded by death and silence, that he met Eleanor Whitman, a nurse from the Army Nurse Corps who had volunteered to serve overseas. She was from Chicago, had freckles on her cheeks, and a voice that didn't tremble, not even under pressure. He hadn't expected to fall in love, not in the snow, not in war. But love doesn't ask permission. Their time together had been brief, days, maybe a week. She treated his wounds with a gentleness that made him forget where he was. And at night, when the shelling stopped, she sat near him and talked about everything except the war. Books, coffee, her sister's wedding. He would listen, and every now and then reach for a pencil and a piece of paper he'd scavenged from a French shopkeeper's abandoned journal. He began sketching notes. At first, just dots and lines, random thoughts. But then came the structure, the beginning, a theme. One night, as the rest of the wounded slept and Eleanor hummed a tune that reminded her of home, he played it for her. Clumsily, softly, using a half-working accordion one of the Belgians had left behind in the rubble. It was the first and only time he played it for her. A song born in the middle of destruction, a fragile thing carved out of noise and cold and hope. He had promised, before they parted, that if they ever made it out, he'd play that song again, every day if he had to. She smiled and told him she'd know it when she heard it, that it would be their signal. Then the war, in its cruel logic, separated them. Walter was evacuated. She was reassigned. Their letters, many of them, never made it through. Censors, postal failures, war bureaucracy, names changed, addresses lost. He searched for her, sent inquiries, wrote again and again, but the silence never broke. And so, years later, back in America, when Charleston became his quiet corner of the world, he began to play, at first once a week, then every day, always the same time, always the same melody, because if there was even the slightest chance that she, somewhere, somehow, was still alive and passing through, she would hear it and know. He never explained this to anyone, never told the local paper when they asked, never shared it with the neighbor who brought him soup on cold days. This song, this place, it belonged to her, and to a promise made in whispers beneath falling snow. Decades passed, the song remained, and then, on a crisp October afternoon in 1973, as the trees burned orange and the sea air turned sharp, a woman walked by. She was in her late 50s, graceful, sharp eyes, a blue coat buttoned to her neck. She paused mid-step. Her breath caught, her purse slid off her shoulder and hit the ground. She stared at Walter, not at his face, but at his hands, and then she whispered, "Thomas?" He looked up, stunned. The name pierced him like a bullet. Thomas, the name he had used overseas to protect his identity, the name she knew him by, a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in 30 years. He whispered back, voice hoarse, "Ellie?" Some songs aren't written to be heard. They're written to be remembered. The winter of 1944 was among the coldest Europe had seen in a century. But for Walter Grayson, what made it unforgettable wasn't just the bitter wind or the roar of artillery. It was Eleanor Whitman, a woman with copper-red hair tucked under a military cap, a nurse's armband on her sleeve, and a calmness in her voice that made the shell fire feel miles away, even when it was only yards. He had landed in France in the summer, like so many other young Americans, full of nerves and purpose. By December, he was bleeding in the ruins of a Belgian farmhouse outside Bastogne, surrounded by snow and silence, the world stripped of color and warmth. He'd been hit during a night patrol, shrapnel to the leg, maybe a broken rib, and left for dead by the roadside until another soldier dragged him into what remained of shelter. That's where he met her. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She didn't flinch at blood. She didn't hesitate when she had to pull off part of his uniform, clean the wound, or whisper to keep him conscious. She was from Chicago, he learned, had joined the Army Nurse Corps straight out of nursing school because she couldn't bear the idea of watching from the sidelines. "If people are going to die," she had said to him one night, "then someone ought to be there to try and stop it, or at least hold their hand when it happens." Walter had heard bravery before, in speeches and orders barked down lines of mud-soaked troops. But this was something else. This was quiet, steady, real. The first time she smiled at him, it was over a spoonful of powdered soup. He was half delirious, groggy from pain and cold, but he remembered the way her face softened and how the light from a nearby oil lamp caught in her eyes. That moment stayed with him longer than any medal or headline ever would. There were others in that farmhouse, injured, freezing, waiting, but at night, when it was just the two of them awake, she would talk. About her brother, who had died in North Africa. About her mother, who wrote her letters filled with recipes and Bible verses. About music, jazz mostly. She missed radios, she said. Records, melodies that didn't sound like gunfire. Walter didn't say much, but he listened. And when he felt strong enough to sit up, he asked her for a pencil and some paper. She thought he was writing a letter, but he was writing music. It started as scattered notes, not lyrics, not a full composition, just the shape of a melody he could hear in her voice, in the way she moved, the sound of stillness in chaos, of wanting to stay, knowing you couldn't. One night, he found an accordion, dusty, water-damaged, probably abandoned by a German soldier, buried in the corner of the collapsed dining room. It barely worked. One key stuck, another wheezed, but it could still make music. He played it for her quietly, his breath fogging the cold air, his fingers clumsy from the bandages. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. "I don't know what to call it," he told her. "You don't need to," she replied. "I'll know it when I hear it." That was the night he told her his name wasn't Thomas, that it was a cover, a safety net in case things went wrong. He told her his real name was Walter, but she only smiled and said, "You'll always be Thomas to me. That's the name I met when you were bleeding, and I didn't walk away." The next morning, the order came to evacuate the wounded. Walter was one of them. Eleanor was assigned to stay. There was no goodbye, just a glance, a whisper. "Play it," she said. "If you make it out." He never forgot those words. Back in the States, the war ended, but the search began. He wrote letters, dozens, to hospitals, to old units, to people he thought might have known her. He never heard back. Maybe the mail was lost. Maybe she had died in some other bombed-out village, or married someone else. Maybe she just never got his letters. He couldn't know. So he made a decision. If he couldn't find her, he'd let her find him. He rewrote the melody, cleaned it up, gave it structure, heart, soul. He carried it with him through odd jobs and late nights and silent years. And when he moved to Charleston, a city where he knew no one, but where the trees whispered like a voice in the snow, he began to play. Not once, not twice. Every afternoon, because that song was never about performance. It was about keeping a promise. Some romances don't fade, they just wait, frozen in a song, waiting for the right ears to listen. Her voice barely carried above the rustling leaves, but for Walter Grayson it was as if the world itself had fallen silent to make room for that one word, Thomas. It wasn't a question, not really. It was memory, breathless and fragile, a name that had been sealed away like a letter in a locked drawer, only now opened after 3 decades of silence. Walter turned slowly, his body slower than his mind, his heart faster than both. There were tourists behind her, children laughing in the distance, a dog barking near the waterfront, but in that moment, the only thing he could see was her. She stood a few feet away, hands trembling, her purse forgotten at her feet, her breath short. She looked older, yes. Time had moved across her face in soft strokes. Silver hair, fine lines at the edges of her eyes, the subtle weight of years lived. But her posture, her eyes, that small questioning tilt of her head, it was Eleanor. He whispered her name, the way you speak to something you've seen 1,000 times in dreams, but never expected to see in daylight. Ellie? She stepped forward, slowly, as if afraid a wrong move might break the illusion. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Instead, she reached out and touched the sleeve of his jacket just lightly, like she needed to confirm that he was real. Not a song, not a ghost, not just the echo of a memory playing on a stranger's accordion. Then came the tears, quiet, gentle, without drama. The kind you cry not from sorrow, but from something deeper. Relief, maybe. The release of grief you didn't know you were still carrying. "I thought you died," she finally said, her voice cracking. "I waited and waited, and then nothing. I thought the war had taken you like all the others." Walter blinked hard. "I looked for you," he said. "After the war, I wrote to every hospital I could think of, every unit. I used your name, your hometown. I even wrote to a radio station in Chicago. I thought maybe they'd read my letter on air." She laughed quietly as she knelt to retrieve her purse. "I wrote too," she said, "to military archives, the Red Cross. I didn't know your real name. I only had Thomas. It was like trying to find someone in a city that no longer existed." They sat down together on the bench, side by side, still not quite believing the other was truly there. He handed her a handkerchief, an old folded square of linen he kept in his coat pocket, and she held it without using it, as if it, too, was a fragile relic of another life. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing it across her lap. Walter recognized the handwriting before he saw the notes. It was his, the original melody. The sketch he'd given her, scribbled in pencil on a torn page of army stationery. She had kept it all those years, tucked between pages of a book she brought with her across Europe and back to the States. She had memorized it. That was how she knew. The moment she heard him playing, she knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. It was him. "I was visiting my sister," she said. "She moved here after her husband died. I come every October. I always walk through this park. But today was the first time I heard it." Walter couldn't speak. Not yet. He simply held the music sheet in both hands, as if he were afraid it might dissolve into dust. "I thought about playing it," she added, her voice soft, "after I got home from the war, but it never felt right. It wasn't mine to play, it was yours. I always thought maybe if you were alive, you'd be out there somewhere playing it." "And I was," he said, "every day, for 30 years. They sat there together until the light began to fade and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. Neither asked about marriages, children, careers, losses. None of that mattered, not now. What mattered was that the melody had worked. The song had traveled across decades, through silence, through the noise of life, and found its way back. Before they parted that evening, Walter asked if she would come again tomorrow. Not to talk, not to explain, just to listen. She smiled. "Only if you promise to play it again." "I will," he said, "but only if you promise to stay." And for the first time in decades, the promise wasn't made to a ghost in the distance. It was made to someone sitting right beside him. Sometimes the name we forgot how to say is the one that was waiting all along to be heard again. The next day, Walter arrived at the park a few minutes early. For 30 years, he had been precisely on time. Never late, never early. But that morning, something inside him had shifted. The ritual that once belonged to silence and hope now had a pulse again. He polished the accordion's worn keys with a handkerchief and sat quietly, waiting, not for fate, not for memory, but for Eleanor. She arrived just as the sun began to turn the harbor gold. Her pace was steady, her coat buttoned up against the early autumn chill, and in her hands she carried something new, a small leather envelope, weathered at the corners and tied with faded blue string. When she sat beside him, there was no need for greetings. The way she settled in, the way their shoulders lightly touched, was enough. They sat in stillness for a moment before she placed the envelope in his lap. "I wasn't sure I still had them," she said. "They were buried in a box of my mother's things. I found them last year, after she passed." Walter untied the string carefully, like unwrapping something sacred. Inside were 6 unopened letters, all addressed to Thomas Grayson, each marked with return addresses from hospitals, post offices, and temporary homes Eleanor had stayed in after the war. None had ever reached him. Some were marked "Return to Sender." Others had been opened, stamped with military censorship approvals, and then discarded. 2 had been forwarded from address to address. One even bore a note scrawled in pencil, "No longer stationed here." Walter read the names, the dates. His hands trembled. "I wrote every month for a year after the war," she said. "I didn't know where to send them. I used what I had, places we passed through, army records. I even tried the paper in Chicago, hoping they might print something." He swallowed hard. "I wrote you too. After I got back, I asked everyone I could. No one knew anything. I even got a letter back once from the Red Cross saying you had been transferred, but they couldn't disclose where." "So we were looking for each other," she whispered. "All that time." He nodded slowly. "It wasn't time that kept us apart. It was everything else." They didn't speak for a while after that. There was too much inside them to put into words. Years had been lost, not in neglect, not in cruelty, but in the quiet brutality of a system that separated people even after the bullets had stopped flying. Walter reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a thin notebook. It was brown, the spine cracked, its pages filled with ink and time. From it he removed a photograph, old, frayed, black and white. It was Eleanor. She stood in the corner of a ruined room, looking directly at the camera. The picture was partially burned on one side, the corner edges browned like the edge of a letter kissed by fire. Her face was faintly smiling, her hands clasped in front of her. There were soldiers in the background, blurred and barely visible. "I've carried this every day since the war," Walter said, his voice barely more than a breath. "When I couldn't find you, I kept this close. I figured if I forgot your face, that would be the end of everything." She took the photo from him gently and smiled, not because she hadn't seen it in years, but because she didn't even know it had been taken. "I never had a picture of you," she admitted. "Just the music. That was all I had left." He looked at her. "That's all I had too." They shared stories then, not dramatic tales, but soft ones. How Walter had worked as a postal clerk, then later a librarian, never really settling, never really staying anywhere long. He never married. "I tried," he said, "but it always felt like I was betraying something." Eleanor had lived a quieter life. She had returned to nursing, then eventually moved into teaching. She'd helped raise her sister's children after an accident took their parents. "I wasn't alone," she said, "but I was never really known either." The world had expected them to move on, to put the war behind them, to marry, to build, to forget. But neither of them ever truly did. Because while war may end on paper, it doesn't always leave the heart so easily. Eleanor opened her purse again and pulled out a folded piece of sheet music. Aged, delicate, but still intact. It was the melody, the one Walter had written for her in a Belgian farmhouse, the one she had tucked into a novel and carried through Europe, through cities and years and silence. "I brought it home with me," she said, "and I played it once, just once, on a piano that belonged to a friend, but I couldn't finish it. It didn't sound right without you." Walter looked down at his accordion. "Would you like to hear it now?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. He played it slowly, softly, not as a performance, not as a call into the void, but as something shared, something present. This time, she was beside him. This time, her eyes were open, watching. This time, there were no missing letters, no failed addresses, no half-forgotten names, just the two of them, and the music. As he reached the final notes, she took his hand. It wasn't trembling anymore. And then, in a quiet voice, she asked, "Do you think it's too late for us?" He smiled. "It's not the years that matter," he said. "It's the song that brought us back. Time didn't steal their story. It only paused it until they were ready to finish it together." In the weeks that followed, the park began to feel different. Not to the passers-by, not to the joggers or the tourists or the children feeding squirrels, but to Walter and Eleanor, who now came together every afternoon, sitting side by side on the same bench, where a melody had once carried all of his longing into the wind. He still played the song, but it sounded different now. Not because the notes had changed, but because they no longer reached out into the unknown. The music no longer searched. It rested, it lived. Every afternoon, just as the light began to soften across the Charleston harbor, Walter would take out his accordion and play, not to be found, but to remember, to honor the silence that had once been between them, to give thanks for the unlikely thread of fate that had drawn Eleanor back into his life, not when they were young, not when it would have made more sense, but now, when they had the stillness to truly hold one another's presence. People began to notice. The quiet man with the music was no longer alone. Now there was a woman beside him, sometimes with her eyes closed, sometimes humming along, sometimes simply watching him play, with a look of peace only those who've known deep waiting can wear. They never made a spectacle of themselves. There were no declarations, no announcements. Their love wasn't loud, it was lived. In the way she poured his tea in the mornings, in the way he adjusted the blanket over her knees when the wind picked up, in the notebook she now filled not with memories of war, but of these quiet days, each one more miraculous in its simplicity than anything either of them had ever dared to hope for. They didn't talk much about the lost years. What was the point? Regret had no room in a life where presence had finally arrived. They couldn't rewrite the past, but they could live the ending, fully together. One morning, Eleanor placed a small handwritten note inside her journal. It was just a line. Some stories take longer to be told, because the ending is waiting to be worthy of the beginning. Walter read it later that evening and kissed her forehead without saying a word. And then, one autumn afternoon, almost exactly a year after she had first whispered his name again, Walter finished the song, gently closed his accordion, and turned to her. "You know," he said, "I don't think I need to play it anymore." Eleanor smiled, reaching for his hand. "That's because you're no longer waiting." "No," he said. "Now I'm just living." They stayed there, watching the tide roll in, as the light faded over Charleston and the music at last found its home. Some songs aren't meant to be hits. They're meant to find someone. And when they do, they don't end. They just become quiet enough to live inside the heart. We share true stories like this every day. If this one moved you, leave a comment and tell someone you love.